The scream of wind tearing across the mesa could have been mistaken for a woman's wail. But Grace Ramsey knew better as she pressed her body against the barn door, forcing it shut against the furious March storm that had descended on Deeming, New Mexico, like the wrath of an angry god. Inside the weathered structure, the pregnant heifer bellowed in distress, her eyes rolling white with fear and pain as lightning split the sky and thunder shook the very foundations of the earth beneath them. Grace had seen the ranch hands scatter to the main house 20 minutes earlier when the first hail started pelting down like bullets, their faces pale and determined as they abandoned the livestock to fate and sought shelter for themselves. She could not blame them entirely, for this storm was unlike anything she had witnessed in her 22 years, but neither could she leave the suffering animal alone to die in terror. The heifer was down on her side now, her flanks heaving with the strain of labor gone wrong, and Grace knew with certainty that both cow and calf would perish without intervention. Her father had taught her the basics of animal husbandry before his death 2 years prior, and her brother had filled in the gaps before he left for California 6 months ago, leaving her alone to manage what remained of the Ramsey homestead. The ranch was small, barely more than a few acres of scrubland and a dozen head of cattle, but it was hers, and it represented everything her family had built in this unforgiving territory since arriving in 1881. Now, in the spring of 1885, Grace stood as the last Ramsey in Deeming, a woman alone in a world that preferred its females decorative and dependent. She rolled up her sleeves and approached the heifer with calm determination, speaking in low, soothing tones that were swallowed by the roar of wind and rain hammering against the barn's roof. The animal's breathing was labored, desperate, and Grace could see the problem immediately. The calf was breech, its hindquarters presenting instead of the head and front hooves that should emerge first in a normal birth. Without help, the calf would suffocate, and the mother would likely hemorrhage or die from exhaustion. Grace had assisted in difficult births before, but never alone, never in conditions like these, with the world ending outside and her hands the only thing standing between life and death. She gathered the supplies she would need, her movements efficient despite the fear singing in her veins. Clean rags, a bucket of water she had fortunately filled before the storm hit, rope if she needed it, and the precious bottle of carbolic acid solution her father had always used to prevent infection. The barn's interior flickered between shadow and brilliant illumination as lightning continued its violent dance across the sky, and Grace forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly, to remember everything she had been taught. The work was brutal and bloody, requiring strength she did not know she possessed, and a determination born of pure stubbornness. Grace pushed her arm deep into the birth canal, feeling for the calf's legs, trying to reposition the unborn animal while the mother thrashed and bellowed. Sweat poured down Grace's face despite the cold wind that found every crack in the barn's walls, and her muscles screamed with the effort of holding position while manipulating the calf's body. Time became meaningless, measured only in heartbeats and contractions, and the gradual progress of tiny hooves shifting, turning, finally presenting in the correct position. When the calf finally slid free in a rush of fluid and membrane, Grace fell backward onto the hay-strewn floor, gasping for air and shaking with exhaustion. The small bull calf lay motionless, and for a terrible moment, Grace thought all her effort had been for nothing. Then training overtook despair, and she was moving again, clearing the membrane from the calf's nose and mouth, rubbing its body vigorously with clean rags to stimulate breathing. The mother, exhausted but alive, lifted her head to watch with dark, liquid eyes. The calf's first breath was a wet, rattling gasp that transformed into a healthy ball of protest at being thrust into the cold, violent world. Grace laughed, the sound bordering on hysteria, and continued rubbing until the calf was breathing steadily and trying to lift its oversized head. The mother was already struggling to her feet, instinct driving her to tend to her newborn despite her own exhaustion, and Grace moved away to give them space, to let nature complete what she had started. She was slumped against the barn wall, covered in blood and birth fluids, her dark hair plastered to her skull with sweat and rain, when the door burst open and a man stumbled inside on a blast of wind and stinging rain. Grace scrambled to her feet, reaching for the pitchfork that leaned nearby, but the stranger raised his hands in a gesture of peace, his eyes wide as he took in the scene before him. He was tall and lean, built like a man accustomed to hard physical labor, with dark hair hanging in wet strands across his forehead and eyes the color of whiskey in firelight. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy, sturdy denim and leather soaked through by the storm, and he wore a gun on his hip with the casual ease of someone who knew how to use it. Grace guessed he was perhaps 25 or 26, young enough to still have the restless energy of youth, but old enough to have learned some wisdom from the harsh land. "Christ Almighty," he breathed, his voice a deep rumble barely audible over the storm. "You delivered that calf alone." Grace lifted her chin, defensive and exhausted in equal measure. The hands ran for cover. Someone had to help her. The stranger moved closer, his boots squelching in the mud and water that had blown in through gaps in the walls. He approached the heifer and calf with the careful movements of a man who understood animals, checking them both with gentle, competent hands while the mother watched him warily, but allowed his touch. When he turned back to Grace, there was something in his expression she could not quite read, a mixture of admiration and disbelief, and something warmer that made her suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "That was breech," he said, "and it was not a question. You reached in and turned it yourself." "There was no one else," Grace repeated, feeling the need to defend her actions though he did not seem critical. "I have helped with difficult births before, though never quite like this." The man shook his head slowly, and a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Lady, I have worked cattle for 10 years from Texas to Montana, and I have seen grown men refuse to handle a breech birth in good weather. What you just did in this storm alone," he paused, his eyes holding hers. "That took more courage than most people have in their entire bodies." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks and told herself it was merely the lingering exertion from her work. "You are caught in the storm yourself, I see. Were you traveling through?" "Maxwell Zimmerman," he introduced himself, extending a hand that was almost as bloody and dirty as her own. "I ride for the Double J Ranch about 15 miles east of here. I was scouting for strays when this storm blew up out of nowhere. I saw your barn and hoped for shelter, but it seems like I arrived too late to be of any use." Grace took his hand, feeling the calluses and strength in his grip. "Grace Ramsey, this is my property or what is left of it. You are welcome to wait out the storm here, Mr. Zimmerman." "Maxwell," he corrected, "or Max if you prefer. And I appreciate the hospitality, Miss Ramsey." The storm raged for another 2 hours, and in that time, Grace learned that Maxwell Zimmerman had been working cattle since he was 15, that he had come west from Missouri after the war between the states ended, though he had been too young to fight himself, and that he had a dry sense of humor that surfaced even in the most uncomfortable circumstances. They tended the heifer and calf together, making sure both were stable and healthy, and Grace cleaned herself up as best she could with the remaining water and rags while Maxwell politely focused his attention elsewhere. When the conversation turned to her own situation, Grace found herself more forthcoming than she normally would have been with a stranger. Perhaps it was the intimacy of the storm, the barn feeling like the only solid thing in a world gone mad. Or perhaps it was something in Maxwell's steady presence that invited confidence. She told him about her father's death from pneumonia, her brother's departure for opportunities in California, and her determination to hold onto the ranch despite pressure from neighboring landowners who saw a woman alone as easy prey. "The Double J has been fair enough," Grace admitted, "but some of the other ranchers have made offers that were more threat than business proposition. They seem to think I will simply give up and leave, or marry someone who will take control of the property." Maxwell's jaw tightened at that, a flash of anger crossing his features. "Men who would pressure a woman alone are not worthy of the title. You have had trouble from them." "Nothing I could not handle," Grace said, though in truth there had been some incidents that had frightened her more than she wanted to admit. "I can shoot, and I am not afraid to defend what is mine." "I do not doubt it," Maxwell said, and there was that warmth in his eyes again, the look that made Grace's heart beat faster. "Any woman who would deliver a calf in a storm like this is not someone to be trifled with." When the storm finally broke and weak sunlight began to filter through the clouds, Maxwell prepared to leave with obvious reluctance. His horse, a sturdy roan gelding, had found shelter on the lee side of the barn and seemed no worse for wear. Grace walked him out, suddenly reluctant to see him go, though she could not have explained why even to herself. They had known each other for mere hours, had spent that time covered in blood and mud while fighting to save animal lives, yet she felt a connection to this stranger that defied logic. Maxwell mounted his horse but did not immediately ride away. He sat looking down at her, his expression serious, and Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. "Miss Ramsey, I know we have only just met and I have no right to impose, but I would like to call on you properly if you would permit it. I have never met anyone quite like you, and I would very much like to know you better." Grace felt a smile spread across her face, wide and genuine in a way she had not smiled in months. "I would like that very much, Maxwell. You know where to find me." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was almost courtly, his own smile matching hers. "I will return tomorrow if that suits you, perhaps in better weather and cleaner clothes." "Tomorrow," Grace agreed, and watched as he rode away across the muddy landscape, his figure growing smaller until he disappeared over a rise. Only then did she allow herself to acknowledge the wild hope blooming in her chest, fragile and precious as a desert flower after rain. True to his word, Maxwell appeared the next afternoon riding a different horse, a pretty paint mare, and dressed in clean clothes with his dark hair neatly combed. Grace had spent the morning in a flurry of preparation, cleaning the small ranch house from top to bottom, baking bread with their dwindling flour supplies, and changing her dress 3 times before settling on a simple blue calico that brought out the green in her hazel eyes. She felt ridiculous for caring so much, but she could not seem to help herself. They walked the property together, and Grace showed him the challenges she faced with the water supply, the fence sections that needed repair, and the vegetable garden she was trying to coax from the stubborn soil. Maxwell listened with genuine interest, offering suggestions without condescension, treating her opinions with the respect he would give another rancher, rather than dismissing her as merely a woman playing at men's work. It was such a relief to be taken seriously that Grace found herself talking more than she had in months, sharing her plans and dreams for the ranch as well as her fears about her ability to maintain it alone. "You are not afraid of hard work," Maxwell observed as they paused by the small creek that formed the western boundary of her property. And you have good instincts about the land and the animals. What you need is capital and labor, neither of which is easy to come by." "No," Grace agreed, "and neither of which is likely to become available to a woman on her own. Banks will not lend to me without a male guarantor, and I cannot afford to hire hands even if I could find men willing to work for a female boss." Maxwell was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the water flowing past their feet. When he spoke, his voice was careful, almost tentative. "The Double J is a good outfit. Jim Jackson, the owner, is a fair man who treats his workers well and pays an honest wage. He is also getting older and has been talking about wanting to expand into breeding quality stock rather than just running cattle for beef. If you were willing, I could introduce you. He might be interested in some kind of partnership or arrangement that would benefit you both." Grace considered this, hope and caution warring in her chest. "Why would you do this for me? You barely know me." Maxwell turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his eyes made her pulse quicken. "I know enough, Grace. I know you have a strength and determination that humbles me. I know you put yourself at risk to save animals most people would have written off as lost. I know that in one afternoon, talking with you, I have felt more alive and interested than I have in years of drifting from ranch to ranch." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "I know that I want to help you succeed because your success matters to me, even though I have no logical reason for feeling that way so quickly." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "I am not accustomed to people helping me without expecting something in return. The world has taught me to be suspicious of kindness. Then the world has been unkind to you, and I am sorry for that," Maxwell said softly. "I will not lie and say I expect nothing. I expect your company if you will give it. I expect the chance to know you better, to see if this feeling I have when I am near you is something real and lasting. But the help I offer is not contingent on your return of those feelings. If you tell me you want only friendship, I will accept that and still do everything I can to help you keep your ranch." It was perhaps the most honest speech Grace had ever heard from a man, and it moved her more than poetry or flowery declarations could have. She reached out and took his hand, feeling his fingers close around hers with gentle strength. "I feel it too," she admitted quietly. "This connection between us. It frightens me because it is so sudden, so unexpected, but I cannot deny it is there." Maxwell raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. "Then let us take our time and see where it leads. No promises, no pressure. Just two people learning about each other and seeing what grows." Over the following weeks, Maxwell became a constant presence in Grace's life. He introduced her to Jim Jackson, a weathered man in his late 50s with shrewd eyes and a surprisingly progressive attitude toward business. Jackson was indeed interested in improving his breeding stock and saw potential in a partnership with Grace. Her small herd included 2 cows with excellent bloodlines, inherited from her father's careful selection, and Jackson proposed an arrangement where he would provide the use of his prize bull in exchange for first selection of the resulting calves and a small percentage of future sales. More valuable than the business arrangement, however, was Jackson's public endorsement of Grace as a serious rancher, worthy of respect. With the backing of the largest outfit in the area, the other ranchers who had been circling like vultures suddenly backed off, their offers becoming genuinely business-like rather than thinly veiled attempts at intimidation. Grace knew she had Maxwell to thank for this change in fortune, though he shrugged off her gratitude with characteristic modesty. "I merely made an introduction," he said when she tried to express how much his help meant. "You sealed the deal yourself with your knowledge and determination." Jackson told me afterward that he was impressed by your grasp of breeding principles and your realistic assessment of market conditions. That was all you, Grace. They fell into a pattern of spending evenings together after the day's work was done. Sometimes Maxwell would help with repairs around the ranch, his skilled hands making quick work of tasks that would have taken Grace days to complete alone. Other times they would simply sit on the porch and talk, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for their futures. Grace learned that Maxwell had lost his own parents to cholera when he was young, that he had been raised by an uncle who taught him the cattle trade but drank away any profits they made, and that he had struck out on his own at 18 with nothing but his horse and his skills. "I have been saving money for years," Maxwell confessed one evening as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I have dreams of my own place someday, a small ranch where I can breed and train horses. I love cattle work, but horses are my real passion. The way they think, the way they move, the partnership you can build with a good horse, it is like nothing else." Grace watched his face as he spoke, seeing the animation and joy that transformed his features. "Why have you not pursued this dream before now?" Maxwell was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose I was waiting for the right time, the right place. Or maybe I was waiting for the right reason, something beyond just my own ambition." He turned to look at her, and Grace saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes. "Maybe I was waiting for you." The kiss that followed was soft and sweet, a question and an answer all at once. Grace felt the world narrow to the point of contact between them, Maxwell's lips warm and gentle against hers, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with infinite tenderness. When they finally drew apart, both breathing quickly, Grace felt as though something fundamental had shifted in the universe, as though everything before this moment had been leading to this precise point in time. "I love you," Maxwell said, the words simple and direct. "I know it is fast. I know people will say it is foolish, but I cannot keep it inside any longer. I love your strength, your courage, your kindness to animals, and your determination to build something lasting. I love the way you laugh and the way you think, and the way you make me want to be a better man. I love you, Grace Ramsey, and I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of you if you will let me." Grace felt tears spill over, running down her cheeks unchecked. "I love you too. I tried to tell myself it was too soon, that I was being foolish, but my heart knows what it knows. I love you, Maxwell Zimmerman, and I want to build a future with you." They married in June of 1885, in a small ceremony in Deeming's Methodist Church with Jim Jackson and his wife standing as witnesses. Grace wore a dress of cream-colored silk that had been her mother's wedding gown, carefully preserved through years of hard living, and Maxwell wore a new suit that represented a significant portion of his savings. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but the looks that passed between them spoke of promises that went far beyond the words spoken aloud. The wedding night was spent in the ranch house that was now their shared home, and Grace discovered that the passion between them was as strong and true as the friendship they had built. Maxwell was gentle and patient, guiding her through the mysteries of physical love with tenderness and care, and Grace gave herself to him completely, holding nothing back. In the darkness of their bedroom, wrapped in each other's arms, they talked about the future they would build together, the dreams they would pursue side by side. True to his word, Maxwell proved himself a partner in every sense. He continued working for the Double J, but poured every spare moment and dollar into improving their ranch. Together they repaired fences, dug a new well, and expanded the small barn to accommodate the growing herd. Maxwell's knowledge of horses proved invaluable, and they began accepting outside horses for training, earning additional income that they carefully saved and reinvested. The first real test of their marriage came that fall, when Grace discovered she was pregnant. The joy was immediately tempered by fear, for childbirth was dangerous on the frontier, and many women did not survive the ordeal. Maxwell's face went pale when she told him, and she could see the terror lurking behind his smile. "We will get through this together," Grace said firmly, taking his hands in hers. "I am strong and healthy, and we will find the best midwife in the territory. I am not going anywhere, Maxwell. I have too much to live for." Maxwell pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she might disappear if he loosened his grip. "I cannot lose you," he whispered into her hair. "You are my entire world, Grace. You and this child you carry. I will do everything in my power to keep you safe." They made preparations with meticulous care. Maxwell built a proper bed frame to replace the rope bed they had been using, and he stuffed a new mattress with the softest materials he could find. He brought in a midwife from Silver City, a woman named Mrs. Chen, who had delivered hundreds of babies with an excellent survival rate for both mothers and children. Mrs. Chen examined Grace thoroughly and pronounced her fit and healthy, giving them detailed instructions for the months ahead. Grace continued working through her pregnancy, though Maxwell fussed over her like a mother hen, constantly trying to take over her tasks and refusing to let her lift anything heavier than a bucket. She found his concern both endearing and frustrating, and they had their first real argument when he insisted she stop helping with the horses. "I am pregnant, not dying," Grace said sharply, her hands on her hips. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time while continuing to work. I will not sit idle for months simply because you are worried." "You delivered a calf in a storm," Maxwell shot back, his voice rising to match hers. "You are exactly the kind of woman who would push herself too hard and ignore warning signs because you are so determined to prove your strength." "I am not trying to control you, Grace. I am trying to protect you and our child." Grace felt her anger deflate as quickly as it had risen. She moved closer to Maxwell, placing her hand on his chest and feeling his racing heartbeat beneath her palm. "I know you are frightened. I am frightened too. But I cannot stop being who I am just because I am carrying a child. I need you to trust me to know my own limits, to listen to my body and ask for help when I need it. Can you do that?" Maxwell covered her hand with his own, his eyes closing briefly. "I will try. But you have to promise me that you will actually ask for help, that you will not push yourself beyond what is safe just to prove a point." "I promise," Grace said, and she meant it. She understood his fear because she shared it, the terror that something would go wrong and shatter the happiness they had built together. But she also knew that living in fear was no way to honor the love they shared. The baby came in early April of 1886, arriving 3 weeks ahead of schedule during a warm spring evening when the desert was blooming with wildflowers. Grace's labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the following afternoon, and there were moments when even Mrs. Chen looked worried. Maxwell paced outside the bedroom door like a caged animal, forbidden from entering but unable to leave, his face growing more haggard with each hour that passed. When the baby's first cry finally rang out, thin and strong, Maxwell burst through the door despite Mrs. Chen's protests. He found Grace propped up against the pillows, exhausted but triumphant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in clean white cloth. Her face was pale and drawn, her hair plastered to her skull with sweat, but her smile was radiant as she looked up at him. "A boy," she said softly. "We have a son, Maxwell." Maxwell approached the bed as though walking on sacred ground, his eyes fixed on the small face peeking out from the blanket. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that would likely change color, but currently seemed to be a murky blue-gray. His tiny hands waved in the air, and when Maxwell offered his finger, the infant grasped it with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Maxwell breathed, wonder transforming his features. "Grace, he is absolutely perfect." They named him Matthew, after Maxwell's father, and he proved to be a healthy, strong baby who thrived despite the harsh environment. Grace recovered quickly from the birth, her natural strength and resilience carrying her through the difficult early weeks. Maxwell took over the majority of ranch work, refusing to let Grace do anything more strenuous than care for the baby, until Mrs. Chen gave her explicit permission to resume normal activities. The first year of Matthew's life was a blur of sleepless nights and endless wonder. Grace and Maxwell took turns walking the floor with the crying baby, collapsed into bed at the end of each day too exhausted for anything but sleep, and somehow managed to keep the ranch running through it all. Jim Jackson proved to be an unexpected source of support, having raised 5 children of his own, and his wife brought over meals and baby clothes with touching generosity. As Matthew grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered beyond anything Grace had dared hope. The partnership with the Double J continued to flourish, and their own herd grew steadily. Maxwell's horse training business expanded through word of mouth, and he gained a reputation for being able to work with difficult animals that others had given up on. They hired their first ranch hand, a young man named Tom who had been orphaned in an Apache raid and needed both work and a place to belong. Grace discovered that motherhood had not diminished her ability to work the ranch, though it had certainly complicated it. She learned to balance Matthew on her hip while feeding chickens, to time her work around his nap schedule, and to include him in ranch activities as he grew old enough to toddle around under watchful supervision. Maxwell proved to be a devoted father, spending every spare moment with his son, teaching him about horses and cattle and the land they lived on. The second major challenge to their happiness came in the spring of 1888, when a drought settled over southern New Mexico like a suffocating blanket. The creek that watered their cattle slowed to a trickle and then dried up entirely, and the grass turned brown and brittle under the relentless sun. Across the territory, ranchers watched their herds die of thirst and starvation, and many gave up entirely, abandoning their land and heading for California or back east. Grace and Maxwell faced the crisis together, rationing their precious well water and driving their cattle to a water source 10 miles away every other day. It was exhausting, back-breaking work that left them both sunburned and worn thin, but they refused to give up. When other ranchers began selling their stock at rock-bottom prices, Maxwell made a bold suggestion. "We should buy them," he said one evening as they sat reviewing their finances by lamplight. "I know it sounds crazy, but hear me out. If we can keep them alive through the drought, we will have tripled our herd when the rains finally come. The price of beef will skyrocket because so many ranchers will have gone under. We could make enough to finally buy the additional land we have been wanting." Grace studied their ledger, calculating quickly in her head. "We would be risking everything. If the drought continues much longer, we could lose it all." "I know," Maxwell acknowledged, "but I have a feeling the rains are coming soon. The clouds have been building differently the past week, and I talked to some of the older Mexican farmers in town. They remember a drought like this in 1868, and it broke in May with floods that nearly washed away the whole territory." Grace thought about the risk, about everything they had built and could lose. Then she thought about the woman she had been 3 years ago, alone and desperate, willing to brave a storm to save a single calf. She thought about the courage that had brought Maxwell into her life, the willingness to take chances that had allowed their love to flourish. "Let us do it," she said firmly. "We will buy every head we can afford and trust that the rains will come." They spent their savings purchasing cattle from desperate ranchers, paying fair prices when they could have gotten away with highway robbery. Word spread about their decency, and ranchers began coming to them first when they needed to sell. By mid-May, they had nearly 200 head of cattle, a mixed collection of breeds and conditions that represented their entire fortune and future. The rains came on May 20th with the same violence and fury as the storm in which Grace and Maxwell had met. The sky opened up and poured water onto the parched land in sheets, filling the creek to overflowing and turning the desert into a temporary lake. Maxwell stood on the porch holding Matthew while Grace stood beside them, all three watching the deluge with feelings too complex for words. "We did it," Grace said softly, leaning her head against Maxwell's shoulder. "We bet everything and we won." "You did it," Maxwell corrected, turning to kiss her temple. "You had the courage to take the risk when anyone sensible would have played it safe." "You are the bravest person I have ever known, Grace Zimmerman." The bet paid off exactly as Maxwell had predicted. By fall, when they drove their fattened cattle to market, beef prices had indeed skyrocketed. Ranchers who had held on through the drought made fortunes, and Grace and Maxwell found themselves with more money than they had ever imagined possessing. They used it to buy an additional 500 acres adjoining their original property, and to build a proper ranch house with multiple bedrooms, a real kitchen, and even a parlor for receiving visitors. Matthew was 3 years old when his brother was born in the winter of 1889. James came into the world during a gentle snowfall, arriving quickly and easily compared to his older brother's difficult birth. He had Maxwell's dark eyes and Grace's stubborn chin, and he announced his presence in the world with a lusty cry that made them all laugh. Matthew was fascinated by the new baby, wanting to help with everything and constantly asking when James would be big enough to play. Life settled into a rhythm that felt almost too good to be true. The ranch continued to thrive, their reputation growing throughout the territory. Maxwell's horse training business expanded to the point where he built a separate training facility and hired 2 additional hands to help with the work. Grace managed the cattle operation and kept the books, her sharp mind and careful planning ensuring they continued to prosper even in difficult years. They faced the usual challenges of frontier life, the small crises and occasional catastrophes that were part of living in such an unforgiving environment. There was the winter when pneumonia swept through the area, and both boys fell desperately ill, leaving Grace and Maxwell taking turns sitting up through long nights, sponging fevered skin, and praying to a God they hoped was listening. There was the summer when rustlers made off with 30 head of their best cattle, and Maxwell and Jim Jackson's men tracked them into Arizona, returning the cattle and ensuring the rustlers faced frontier justice. There was the spring when a grass fire threatened to consume everything they had built, and every able-bodied person in the county turned out to fight the flames, saving the ranch, but leaving them all blackened and exhausted. Through it all, the love between Grace and Maxwell only deepened and strengthened. They learned each other's rhythms and moods, developing a shorthand communication that required few words. Maxwell learned to recognize when Grace needed space to work through a problem alone, and Grace learned when Maxwell's silence meant he was troubled rather than simply tired. They made time for each other despite the demands of ranch and children, stealing moments alone to talk or simply be together, maintaining the connection that had sparked to life in a barn during a storm. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Maxwell presented Grace with a gift that left her speechless. It was a deed to a small property in town, a building that had previously housed a dry goods store but now stood empty. When Grace looked at him in confusion, Maxwell smiled and explained, "I know you have talked about wanting to do more for the women in the area, the ones who are struggling alone like you were when we met. This could be a place for them to sell their goods, their eggs and butter and preserves, without having to negotiate with male store owners who cheat them on prices. You could run it as a cooperative, taking a small percentage for upkeep, but ensuring the women get fair value for their work. What do you think?" Grace threw her arms around his neck, tears streaming down her face. "I think I married the most wonderful man in the entire world. This is perfect, Maxwell. Absolutely perfect." The cooperative opened in the fall of 1890 and became an immediate success. Women from all over the county brought their goods to sell, and Grace discovered a talent for business that went beyond ranch management. She kept scrupulous records, ensured fair treatment for all participants, and used her growing influence to help negotiate better prices with buyers from larger cities. The cooperative became not just a business but a community, a place where women could gather and share information and support each other. Life continued its forward march, bringing changes both welcome and challenging. Matthew started school in town, riding in with Maxwell each morning and returning full of stories about his classmates and lessons. James proved to be a different child entirely from his older brother, quieter and more observant, happiest when working with the animals. He showed an early aptitude for training horses that delighted Maxwell, and made it clear he would likely take over that aspect of the ranch business when he was older. Grace discovered she was pregnant again in 1892, and this time the news brought only joy rather than fear. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and their daughter Sarah was born during a beautiful October evening when the air was cool and fresh. She was a tiny thing, much smaller than her brothers had been, with a cap of reddish-brown hair that suggested she might take after Grace's mother, who had been known for her auburn locks. Sarah's birth seemed to complete their family in a way Grace had not realized was missing. She watched Maxwell with their daughter, seeing a tenderness in him that was different from how he was with the boys, a gentle protectiveness that made her fall in love with him all over again. Matthew and James doted on their little sister, competing for the privilege of helping care for her and entertaining her with increasingly elaborate games. The ranch grew into one of the most successful operations in southern New Mexico. By 1895, they ran nearly 1,000 head of cattle and had become known throughout the territory for the quality of their breeding stock. Maxwell's horse training facility had expanded to include breaking and training for ranches as far away as Texas and Arizona, and he employed a half-dozen skilled hands who had learned their trade under his patient guidance. Grace's cooperative had also flourished beyond her wildest dreams. It had expanded to include not just food goods, but also textiles, leather work, and crafts, providing income for more than 50 women in the area. She had become a voice for women's interests in the community, respected by men and women alike for her business acumen and her fair dealing. When the question of New Mexico statehood arose, Grace was invited to speak about the concerns of women property owners, a recognition that would have been unthinkable when she had first arrived in Deeming. They celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary in 1895 with a party that seemed to include half the county. Tables were set up under the stars in their ranch yard, laden with food contributed by dozens of friends and neighbors. There was music and dancing, and Grace found herself swept into Maxwell's arms for a waltz while their children watched with amused tolerance. "Did you ever imagine this?" Maxwell asked softly as they moved together, perfectly in sync after a decade of partnership. When you were alone in that barn, fighting to save a calf while a storm tried to tear the world apart, did you imagine this life we have built?" Grace looked up at him, seeing the silver beginning to thread through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into the sun and smiling at his family. She thought about the frightened young woman she had been, desperate and alone, and the woman she had become, confident and loved and surrounded by community. "No," she admitted. "I imagined survival maybe if I was lucky. I imagined holding on to the ranch and somehow making it through. But this, a love like ours, children who are healthy and happy, a business that supports not just our family but our entire community. This was beyond anything I dared to dream." Maxwell pulled her closer, his lips brushing her forehead. "I knew," he said quietly. "The moment I walked into that barn and saw you covered in blood and exhausted and triumphant, I knew you were the one. I knew that if I could convince you to let me into your life, we would build something extraordinary together. You were so brave, so determined, so absolutely magnificent. I fell in love with you in that instant, even though I did not have words for it yet." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, though she was smiling. "I thought you were crazy, appearing out of the storm like some kind of vision. I thought I was hallucinating from exhaustion when you said I had done something extraordinary. But then you kept showing up, kept believing in me, kept seeing possibilities where I only saw obstacles. You taught me to hope again, Maxwell. You gave me back my future." They danced until the stars wheeled overhead, until their children fell asleep in piles on blankets spread in the grass, until the last of their guests had departed with hugs and promises to visit again soon. Then they walked together through their ranch, hand in hand, looking at everything they had built and everything they had become. The years that followed brought the usual mixture of joy and sorrow that makes up a life fully lived. They lost Jim Jackson to a heart attack in 1897, and Grace and Maxwell helped his widow manage the transition of the Double J to the Jackson children. Grace's cooperative survived an attempt by male merchants to shut it down through legal challenges, emerging stronger and more established than ever. Matthew left for college in California, becoming the first in either of their families to pursue higher education, while James stayed home and took over the horse training business with a skill that surpassed even his father's considerable talent. Sarah grew into a force of nature, combining her mother's determination with her father's charm in equal measures. She announced at age 10 that she intended to become a veterinarian, a profession unheard of for women, and neither Grace nor Maxwell had any doubt she would succeed. They supported her ambitions the same way they had always supported each other, with unwavering belief and practical assistance. Grace and Maxwell grew older together, their bodies showing the wear of hard physical labor but their spirits remaining strong. They still made time for evenings on the porch, still talked through problems and shared dreams, still reached for each other in the night with the same passion that had ignited between them decades earlier. The ranch hands grew accustomed to seeing them steal kisses when they thought no one was watching, to the way they moved around each other with unconscious coordination, to the love that radiated from them like heat from a fire. In the spring of 1900, as the new century dawned full of promise and change, Grace and Maxwell stood together on the porch of their ranch house and looked out over the land they had built together. Matthew was home from college for the summer, already planning to return to Deeming and apply his education to modernizing their cattle operation. James was in the training ring with a difficult mare, his patience and skill evident in every movement. Sarah was in town at the cooperative, helping manage the business that would likely be hers to run someday. 15 years, Grace said softly, leaning against Maxwell's side. 15 years since a storm brought us together. The best 15 years of my life, Maxwell replied, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. Though I have to say, you look even better now than you did covered in blood and birth fluids in that barn. Grace laughed and swatted his arm. Flatterer. Though I suppose I should be grateful you found me attractive even in such a state. I found you magnificent, Maxwell corrected, his voice turning serious. I still do. Every single day I look at you and I am amazed by your strength, your intelligence, your capacity for love. You took a failing ranch and turned it into an empire. You took my wandering heart and gave it a home. You created a family and a community and a legacy that will outlast us both. You are extraordinary, Grace Zimmerman, and I count myself the luckiest man alive that you chose to share your life with me. Grace turned in his arms, looking up into the face she loved more than any other. She saw the boy he had been and the man he had become, saw the traces of every year they had spent together written in the lines of his face and the warmth of his eyes. She reached up to cup his cheek, feeling the familiar roughness of his skin beneath her palm. We did this together, she said firmly. Every bit of it we built together. You believed in me when I had stopped believing in myself. You stood beside me through every challenge and celebrated every victory. You gave me children and love and partnership beyond anything I had imagined possible. If I am extraordinary, it is because you showed me how to be. They kissed as the sun set over the New Mexico desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple. Around them, their ranch hummed with life and purpose. Animals settling for the night and children grown nearly to adulthood preparing for their own futures. The land that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving had become home, shaped by their labor and love into something beautiful and lasting. As darkness fell and stars began to emerge in the vast sky above, Grace and Maxwell went inside together, ready for whatever the future might bring. They had faced storms and droughts, dangers and difficulties, and had emerged stronger each time. They had built not just a ranch but a life, not just a business but a community, not just a marriage but a love story that would be told for generations. In the years that followed, their grandchildren would ask about how Grace and Maxwell had met, and the story of the storm and the calf would take on the quality of legend. But those who had known them, who had seen them work side by side and watched their love deepen with each passing year, knew that the real miracle was not the dramatic beginning but the life they had built together, day by day, choice by choice, challenge by challenge. Matthew eventually returned permanently to Deeming, bringing with him a wife he had met at college and new ideas about ranch management that revolutionized their operation. James married a local girl whose family ran a small horse ranch, and the joining of the two families created an empire that dominated the horse breeding industry throughout the Southwest. Sarah did indeed become a veterinarian, studying in the East and returning home to practice, becoming famous throughout the territory for her skill and dedication. Grace and Maxwell lived to see the 20th century transform the frontier they had known. They saw automobiles replace horses on some roads, though never on their ranch. They saw New Mexico finally achieve statehood in 1912, with Grace attending the ceremony as a recognized leader in the business community. They saw their children marry and have children of their own, filling the ranch house with the laughter and chaos of a new generation. Through it all, they remained partners in the truest sense. When Grace developed arthritis that made riding difficult, Maxwell adapted their routines without complaint, taking over tasks she could no longer perform comfortably. When Maxwell's hearing began to fail, Grace became his ears, repeating conversations and making sure he remained connected to the world around them. They moved more slowly, tired more easily, but the bond between them never weakened. On a warm evening in June 1920, Grace and Maxwell celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and what seemed like the entire population of southern New Mexico. The ranch had grown beyond anything they could have imagined, encompassing thousands of acres and employing dozens of workers. The cooperative had expanded to include multiple locations and had become a model studied by business reformers across the country. Their children had grown into successful, compassionate adults who carried forward the values Grace and Maxwell had instilled in them. As the party wound down and the last guests departed, Grace and Maxwell found themselves alone on the porch once more, the place where they had spent so many evenings over the decades. They sat in comfortable silence, hands linked, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Do you remember what you said to me the day after we met?" Grace asked softly. "When you came back to call on me properly," Maxwell smiled, the expression creasing his weathered face into familiar lines. "I said I wanted the chance to see if what I felt when I was near you was real and lasting. I believe we have our answer after 35 years. Real and lasting," Grace agreed. "More real than I knew was possible, more lasting than the mountains themselves. We have built a good life, Maxwell, a life worth living." "The best life," Maxwell corrected, raising her hand to his lips just as he had so many years before. "Made possible because a brave woman chose to deliver a calf in a storm no ranch hand would brave, and a wandering cowboy was smart enough to recognize his future when it appeared covered in blood and determination." Grace laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet ranch yard. "We have come a long way from that barn, you and I." "We have," Maxwell agreed. "But in the ways that matter most, we are still the same people who fell in love in the middle of a crisis. Still ready to face any storm together, still willing to take risks for what we believe in, still devoted to building something that will outlast us both." They sat together until the moon rose full and bright, illuminating the land they had claimed and the life they had built. In the distance, cattle lowed softly to each other, horses moved quietly in their corrals, and the night birds sang their eternal songs. It was the sound of home, the sound of success, the sound of a love story that had begun in violence and fear, but had grown into something beautiful and enduring. Grace and Maxwell Zimmerman lived several more years, growing old together with the same grace and partnership that had defined their entire marriage. When Grace finally passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1924 at the age of 61, Maxwell mourned her deeply, but also celebrated the incredible life they had shared. He followed her less than a year later, and they were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, beneath headstones that bore simple inscriptions of their names and dates, but spoke volumes to those who had known them. Their children and grandchildren continued the legacy they had built, maintaining the ranch and the cooperative and the values of hard work, fair dealing, and compassionate leadership. The story of how Grace and Maxwell had met, of the storm and the calf and the instant connection that had sparked between them, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of the courage and love that had founded their family. The ranch itself stood as their monument, thousands of acres of productive land supporting hundreds of animals and dozens of families. The cooperative continued for decades, evolving with changing times, but always maintaining its core mission of supporting women's economic independence. And in the hearts of all who had known them, Grace and Maxwell lived on as examples of what true partnership could achieve, of how two people who chose to face life's storms together could build something extraordinary that would endure long after they were gone. Years later, when the old barn where they had first met finally collapsed from age and weather, the family salvaged the wood and used it to build a memorial gate at the entrance to the ranch. A plaque mounted on the gate told the story in brief: how Grace Ramsey had delivered a calf in a storm no ranch hand would brave, and how Cowboy Maxwell Zimmerman had known in that moment she was the one. It served as a reminder to all who pass through that the greatest love stories often begin in the most unlikely circumstances, that courage and compassion are the foundations of lasting partnership, and that the storms we brave together make us stronger than we could ever be alone. The tale of Grace and Maxwell became part of the folklore of southern New Mexico, a story told in bars and around campfires, embellished and romanticized, but always retaining its essential truth. It was a story about two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built an empire from almost nothing through hard work and mutual support, and who had loved each other with a devotion that lasted until their final breaths and beyond. Their great-grandchildren still run the ranch today, modern in methods but traditional in values, carrying forward the legacy of courage and partnership that began in a barn during a storm in 1885. The cooperative has evolved into a nonprofit organization supporting women's businesses throughout the Southwest, touching thousands of lives and creating opportunities that Grace could never have imagined but would certainly have celebrated. And somewhere, in the space between memory and legend, Grace and Maxwell danced together under the stars, forever young, forever in love, forever the brave woman and the wandering cowboy who found in each other exactly what they had been searching for. Their story serves as a reminder that true love is not just about grand gestures and dramatic moments, though it may begin with such things, but about the everyday choice to stand together, to support each other's dreams, and to build something lasting from the raw materials of hope and determination and unwavering devotion. The land they loved continues to bloom each spring with wildflowers, transforms each summer under the burning sun, sleeps each winter beneath occasional snow, and awakens each fall to the business of harvest and preparation. The cycle continues, eternal and unchanging, just as the love between Grace and Maxwell continues in the lives they touched and the legacy they left behind. In the end, it was not the storm that defined their story, though it made for dramatic telling. It was not even the brave act of delivering a calf alone that captured the imagination, though it certainly demonstrated character. It was the choice they made, repeatedly, day after day and year after year, to love each other fully and completely, to be true partners in every aspect of life, and to build together something greater than either could have achieved alone. That choice, made over and over again through joy and sorrow, success and struggle, is what transformed a chance meeting in a barn into a love story for the ages.